Hello, my name's Becky Annison of Black Armada Games.
And I am Josh Fox, also of Black Armada Games.
And welcome to the very first episode of Theory on Deck, where Josh and I talk about some aspects of game playing and game theory in a relatable and conversational vlog style. This is an episode which I was really keen to kick off with, which I'm going to title Now Frame a Scene. Because it deals with a particular bugbear of mine, which is how you frame scenes in games.
Okay, but first you maybe should tell us what you mean by framing a scene?
What I mean by framing a scene is how do you set up a scene in a game? So I think that there's what's going to happen in the scene, who's going to be in the scene, where's the scene set, when is the scene set. All of the information that the participants in the scene are going to need in order to have the interesting interaction and conversation. Mm-hmm. I think that's what I mean by framing a scene. What do you mean? Well, do you mean something different when you talk about framing a scene?
Well, so maybe I do. I mean, I think to me, framing a scene is the process of making it so that you can start role-playing. And to do that, we need to know who's there, because otherwise you can't start role-playing, right? And I guess we also need to know who's playing them if they're characters that aren't normally in the story. We usually need to know where they are, because otherwise it's pretty difficult to start. And sometimes we need to know what's happening at the start of the scene. And sometimes we need to know what time it is. But it's just the kind of setting up the parameters that allow you to start playing your character, right? So it's not... but you mentioned, and we'll get to this in a minute, I think, you mentioned what's going to happen in the scene, and that,
yeah, I did.
To me, that is not necessarily part of scene framing, though it could be. I typically don't include it.
Okay. Well, I think the reason this is really important to me is I've played a lot of games in my life, I've played in a lot of scenes in my life, and I've played in some scenes which were amazing, and they flowed like water, you know, and the action and the conversation was just thick and fast and seamless, and everybody seemed to be on the same page, almost with unspoken setting of expectations. And I've been in other scenes which meandered, which floundered, which stopped halfway through because people didn't really know what to do or how to carry on or where to go. And I want to kind of try and work out what it is that we're doing in the scenes that flow like water, and codify it and design it into my games, basically. Because I don't think that there's some special magic that is making those scenes flow like water. I think that we're doing something in those scenes that we're not doing in the others.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think you can design it into your game, or if it's not designed into your game, you can nevertheless kind of build up habits that help to make it happen.
Exactly, because that was one of the things I wanted to sort of say in this talk, is that partly this is about game design. This is about putting things into your scenes and into your scene advice in your games. But also, this is about play and culture. This is about when you're faced with certain games that require a little bit of extra framing, I suppose, to get you where you need to be. It's just building that into your play culture, which I suppose is also design. But that's probably a conversation for another time.
Pretty well stack up to me, but I mean, I guess what's written in the game versus what you bring to the game.
Well, I know that there is a difference here between GM'd games and games without GMs, and I know that's something that you're quite interested in talking about. Do you want to speak about that for a bit?
Sure. So I guess before I do, though, I'd just like to kind of talk about the purpose of the scene, because I think that's to me that's what makes a scene strong. Generally, is if it's got a clear purpose. That's not to say that clear purpose is kind of like for all time. Like, you could go into a scene thinking, I'm going to do this thing, and maybe it turns out to be something else. But if you go in with absolutely no idea of what the scene's about, then it feels like it could quite easily drift to me. So, and the reason why I think GM'd games have an advantage here is because they've built up a play culture over the eons, since role-playing was first created back in the mist of time by Gary Gygax. I'll stop there. I think there's kind of two typical ways to do a scene in a GM'd game, traditionally. One is that the players kind of walk into a GM created situation. The GM kind of knows roughly what they're going to throw at them, and roughly kind of what's on the table there and what the players might have to contend with. And so then it's very clear the GM is the person who's going to describe what the place is, and what they can see and what characters they might be encountering, and generally kind of guide the scene, and the players are reacting to what the GM's doing, right? Alternatively, sometimes the players will say something like, "Oh, I want to go and talk to that crazy old wizard because I think he will have something to help us," or whatever. They got a thing that they want. So then they say, "We're going to go to location X. We want to see person Y," and it all flows from there, and we know why they're doing it too. So again, the scene will flow from that. Now, I think there's a difference there with GMless games, is that there isn't necessarily, it does depend on the game, a clear allocation of, okay, who does this now? There is no GM, and there isn't players kind of asking a GM to go and see the crazy wizard either.
So are you saying that part of what makes the culture in GM scenes much cleaner and clearer is that there's one person who's got the authority for driving it, who you can ask questions to, and there isn't that diffusion, I suppose, of responsibility?
I don't think it is necessarily just that there's one person with authority, although that solves the first part, right? But it's more like everybody has a really clear role. My role as GM is to throw stuff at you. Your role as player is to react to that stuff, and sometimes to say, I want to go and do such and such in the service of dealing with the stuff the GM has thrown at me, probably. That's probably a gross overstatement, but...
Because I was going to say, I think that you can have really clear roles in a non-GM'd game.
Yes, you can.
That still don't help with the problem of scenes drifting.
Also true, yeah.
And so I think that you need something else, a special source. And what I wanted to talk about is that special source, but also how, again, coming back to this as design as well as play culture, that whatever that special source is, it should be different depending on the game you're playing. So whether you're playing Fiasco or Microscope or Dialect or Flotsam or Lovecraft-esque, there's a driving, there's a thing your scene is driving at. There's a meat of the scene which is going to be different because games just give different experiences.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Is that what you're talking about when you talk about purpose?
So what I mean by purpose is what the person... So at least one person has something that they want to do in the scene, and the parameters of the scene are crafted around that. So that's their purpose in the scene, right? It might be there are other people who also have a purpose, but somebody has crafted the parameters of the scene to make that happen. So that, take an example.
Yep.
Let's say I decide I want to sit down next and confess my love for your character, say. So maybe what I say to you is, okay, so later that evening, when you're sat down by the fire, my character comes to yours with a bowl of soup for you, right? I mean, that's kind of... There's lots of things I could be doing in that situation, but I have chosen that situation, sitting by the fire. It's intimate. I'm giving you something to kind of open it up, right? So I haven't just arbitrarily done that in the middle of a corridor in a dungeon or whatever. I've determined a location and a time and people who are there. Like, by implication, there's not really anybody else nearby, and maybe I could even have said when there's no one else nearby, right? So I'm crafting the scene framing, and now I'm ready to deliver on that purpose that I'm going to confess my love for you. Maybe we'll first have a little bit of conversation, but fundamentally I can get down to it and do the thing that I came here to do.
Okay, so that's more interesting than I thought, actually, because I definitely think that scenes should have a purpose, and I think that we need to talk later on about how discussions around that purpose are framed, because I think there's a real spectrum there, but I'll get back to that in a minute. But what you're saying is that somebody needs to have a purpose in mind when they're framing the scene, because where the scene is, who is in the location, how you describe the environment and the setting will all be calibrating the scene, preparing it, making it fertile ground for the purpose. Is that...
Yeah,
Is that right?
so I think that's true, and I think I would say even more broadly, the more people are acting purposefully in a scene, the better that scene will be, and to the extent that the scene is crafted around that purpose, it will be easier to deliver that purpose, and it will feel more cohesive. I could confess my love for you in the middle of a dungeon corridor, and that will still be quite a good scene. It could even be a better scene under the right circumstances if we're like kind of huddling while this monster's kind of just around the corner or something. But the more I've picked the moment, the better that could be, I think. And that's what scene framing is picking a moment, right?
I think it's a bit more than that, actually.
Okay, say more.
Well, I think for me, this comes back to the fact that I think that the purpose of the scene has to be calibrated to the sort of game it is. And what that moment looks like what that moment is trying to deliver is going to be different depending on the game. And in some games it's described in the setup what the purpose that what the delivery of that scene is going to be. And when I say delivery, I mean what is the package it's going to deliver? What is the thing that's going to satisfy me as a player when that scene is over, that the story was moved on in a satisfying and interesting way, in accordance with the expectations we've got about this game, about its genre, about what my character's story arc is going to be, that sort of thing. And I think that just varies wildly from game to game. So one of the games I wanted to talk about is Dialect, because Dialect is a GMless game which gives really clear purpose when you frame scenes.
Yeah.
So Dialect is a game about building a language, how the language evolves and how it dies. And one of the things you do in scenes when you frame them is you decide...
Who frames them?
So the players, I think they frame them collaboratively, actually.
Oh, okay.
But whoever is in the scene has to have a conversation in the scene. So the scene's got a purpose. You're going to have a conversation, although that's true of a lot of scenes. You're going to have a conversation. It's a GMless game. So there isn't going to be a third party mediating that conversation. But that conversation must contain an example of the word from the language you're creating, which you're focusing on for the scene, and how its meaning has changed over time.
Okay.
So you're demonstrating in your conversation, you're having scenes which demonstrate how the language is changing.
Right, and so that... So that's a thing that you have to do with the scene, right? That's a requirement. Is it also the purpose of the scene, would you say?
I would say it's the purpose of the scene.
I mean, could I have a scene where my character declares my love for your character, and while doing so introduces this word and somehow sneakily... So I could have a different purpose in the scene, right?
Well, you as a player could have your own agenda. But what is codified in the rules of the game is the thing that must happen in this scene is that you have a conversation that shows how this word has changed. Like how in Lovecraft-esque, the scene can be whatever you like, but you have to make sure there is a clue dropped in the scene as to what the final horror is.
Oh, you see, I would draw a distinction there. I would say that that's the purpose of the scene, because in Lovecraft-esque, that's kind of what the story is about. You don't have a choice about that. You can't decide in the middle of Lovecraft-esque that you want it to be a story about your love for another character. I don't know, maybe you could do that.
Could you? But what we're really talking about here is having constraints on people which drive them to create something. Because we've talked in our private lives about creativity coming from constraint. It's much easier to draw something when somebody says please draw a cat than when somebody says just draw anything. And I think that's really, really true of role-playing games. And actually when we talk about scene framing, who's in the scene, what's the environment like, that is all giving people a jumping off point. And I think that the who's in the scene, where is the scene, when is it set, isn't enough of a jumping off point. You also need something which defines the meat of what that scene's going to be about. And that maybe now's the time to talk about the spectrum of how you define that, of how you define what the scene's going to be about, because it is a spectrum, isn't it?
Sorry, I'm not sure what you're getting at there.
Oh, so what I mean is that you can go all the way to pre-agreeing the plot arc of the scene,
Right.
and almost even scripting it and deciding how the endpoint's going to be.
Yep.
Or you can say, now frame a scene set in Chicago in 1920 with you two characters in it.
Right.
And in between there is there's a massive spectrum of things that you can predetermine that people are going to have to incorporate or be role-playing towards, or not.
I think you have conflated at least two things there.
You?
I do.
Do you?
Yeah. So I think there's two things. There's,
okay.
if you like, the question that the scene is answering.
Well, that's a bit of a jump. I think you need to explain more about what you mean by that.
Well, I don't mean this literally, although it can be literal. You could quite literally start the scene by saying, this is a scene where we're going to find out whether so-and-so loves so-and-so back, for example, or it could be a question that's in your head where you've explicitly asked yourself, I wonder whether so-and-so loves so-and-so. I will have them go and declare their love and see what happens, right? Or it may be that you didn't even think about it in terms of a question at all, but nevertheless, that is the question the scene is going to answer. So if I have my character come and declare my love for yours, then we're certainly interested in the question of, well, what are you going to say back? We don't end the scene there. We definitely wait to end it, unless we are really cruel and interrupt that scene with something horrible that prevents us from answering a question, and then it's hanging there pregnant over the rest of our interactions, possibly until one of us dies. But generally, right? So that's what I mean by a question. It's the uncertainty around which the scene turns. Okay.
Oh, so when I wrote What the Water Gave Me, I called that part of the scene in the scene framing advice. I called that the dramatic pivot. What is it that all of the drama in this scene is pivoting on?
Yes. Okay.
And revolving around.
Did you frame it as a question or not?
No, I deliberately didn't frame it as a question, which is why I'm really interested to kind of dig into you talking about this explicitly as a question.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess I just think of it as a question because it's uncertainty, right? It wouldn't be very interesting. Well, it would be pre-scripted if we already knew the answer to the question. So if there has to be uncertainty in a scene for there to be suspense, and the question just simply defines what that uncertainty is by asking about it. But you don't have to have asked a question. It could just be an implied question. Anyway, I was just before we go any further with that, because I was saying you were conflating two things. I think there's the question and then there's the answer, right?
Yeah.
So you could pre-script the scene entirely, as you said, on the far end of that spectrum, in which case you are both asking a question and answering it before you've even played the scene, which I think is a little bit sad, and I suppose makes the scene just about, what does that look like? What does that feel like when that thing happens? The question becomes about...
It's not my preference for playing scenes, but I know that there's people out there, sure. And there's games out there which go to that extreme.
And I mean, I can only assume that again, it's not really for me, but I can only assume that the
payoff?
The payoff is then the feeling of playing through that. So the question is that if you want to frame it as a question, the question is then, how is this going to make us feel? Maybe something like that. But yeah, so those are the things I think you're conflating when you say, you could totally prescript it, because you could get the middle way could be, let's ask a question. It could be, let's define an ending and figure out how we're going to get there, which I suppose has its own implied question. Yeah. How do you get to this endpoint, right? But
I wanted to talk about that actually, because there are games out there which have answer this question as the kind of the meat of the scene, the purpose of the scene, the dramatic pivot, answer a specific question or get to this specific endpoint. And actually, I found it quite hard sometimes when I'm in those scenes to almost it almost seems to kind of feel artificial in some ways, that the scene is flowing and now I'm trying to force it to this particular endpoint. I think that might just be a personal preference, is that I prefer to massively front load my scenes in the scene framing part with loads of potential, like messy relationships. How do we feel about each other? What are the secrets we're holding? And let that sort of flow out in a big mess.
Yeah.
And I think it's even harder when you're trying to get to a plot end, like how did we blow up the building? Because when you're doing something which depends less on conversation and scenes which depend more about physically doing things to create conditions to get to an endpoint like that, that's when you kind of would like to fall back on the arbitration of somebody, the GM. So you can ask questions to who can say what works and what doesn't work.
I mean, I feel like the messy relationship stuff, you can think of that in terms of a question, right? You can say, let's say, I remember we played Monster Hearts not that long ago, and you had my character who's had some difficult relationship with this other guy on the football team, and you basically just told me, I'm walking past the football team and I see this asshole who I hate on the football.
Are we going to have to put a swearing beep?
No, this is not. It's not for children. You should have put your children to bed by now. It's nearly 7 o'clock.
This is YouTube. They could be watching it at 7 in the morning.
Okay. Anyway, so I feel like the question there could easily just be, how's he going to react to that? Right? So it's more of an open question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm just trying to draw a distinction that for me,
narrow and
partly it's between narrow and wide, but also it's between things that don't require much external arbitration, because it's all this scene is just an actual conversation.
Yeah.
I know that, I think, is it Vincent Baker who talks about role-playing game as a conversation. It's like, yeah, but within that there are conversations which go like this. Okay, you're walking past the football team and somebody comes at you with a lacrosse stick. What do you do?
Mm-hmm.
Right, now roll some dice. And there's conversations which go, I am your father.
Right.
Somebody would probably say diegetic here at this point, but I wouldn't normally use a word like that. But so I would say conversations which are happening in character are much easier in GMless games in terms of scenes, because you're not looking to anybody else for external input or validation about what's happening in the world around you.
I'm not sure I understand the point you're making, so maybe you should say a bit more about that.
Oh, no.
Why does it matter that it's GMless in this context?
I think it's all getting back to the purpose of the scene. Mm-hmm. So the purpose of the scene in one, we're having a conversation between our characters. We're having an in-character conversation. And so when I wrote some of the advice in What the Water gave me, when I use this phrase dramatic pivot, it's like, what is the dramatic pivot of this conversation?
Yeah.
What is the information that's going to be revealed which is going to change the nature of our relationship once it's come out? What is the thing that somebody's going to say which is going to change this relationship if it's come out? That's the dramatic pivot that's going to happen here. That's the thing we're working towards. So before we start the scene, we determine where it's going to be, who's going to be there, what the general environment is, and then we're both going to have a think about what it is that we're going to say. What one of us has to think about, what's the thing I'm going to say in this scene which is going to dramatically change everything, and our relationship will pivot around it.
Yeah, okay, I see.
And that is different, and that requires different scene framing and a different way of scene framing. To, by the end of this scene, we will have successfully robbed that bank. That's two really different conversations.
Right. So you can do endpoint, right? This is a scene where we're going to drive towards this particular endpoint.
Plot, story, endpoint.
You could do question, where it's like, okay, we're going to see how we answer this question. So that's kind of an uncertainty-based approach. And then your one is more kind of like, we're going to introduce this thing that we know is going to have interesting effects. And then we could, having done that, we could just end the scene there. We just kind of freeze frame and do.
Play the EastEnders theme tune.
Yeah, and then Like,
yeah.
So we're not asking the question, how are you going to react to me revealing that all along I was your father? We're saying, let's introduce that,
and see
and
what
then
happens.
the story will
flow
later on. Maybe
flow from that.
Interesting. Okay. But those are all valid purposes.
Oh yeah,
they are all purposes, and somebody has to have one of those purposes in mind. At least one person has to have one of those purposes in mind. Otherwise, presumably, we'll just kind of interact with each other in a completely organic way, and it might or might not be interesting.
I suppose for me, purpose is part of scene framing, because it's something that at least one person has to have thought about and is going into the scene with the agenda of delivering.
I agree.
I'm up to something in this scene, and the thing I'm up to is making sure that purpose happens.
Okay. I don't think I call that scene framing. I just don't... like, it definitely could strongly inform scene framing for me, but, like, you could frame a scene that you think is about me fighting a dragon, and I could turn it into a scene about me confessing my love for another character. If I go into the scene with that purpose, I have nothing to do with framing the scene other than maybe you say, "Oh, where are you when the dragon appears?" Perhaps.
I think I've expanded the definition of scene framing, and I'm using it in a different way to you. I think you're talking about what's the initial setup in terms of people, location.
Right. I think that's what scene framing means.
And for me, framing a scene is, what are the things that we have to have decided before we start this scene?
Okay. Yeah.
Because if I start the scene and I haven't got a purpose in mind, I might be lucky and one might come into my head, and then it might all flow like water and be brilliant, but it might not.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm not about going into this scene crossing my fingers and hoping I'm going to be lucky. I'm going into this scene ready to deliver on my purpose because I've pre-decided it. So for me, scene framing is, what do you need to decide before you start role-playing to give your scene the best chance of being awesome and fun and deliver an awesome experience.
So I just think we can maybe just separate, maybe not use the word scene framing if we've got slightly different ideas about what it means, but
okay.
There's the kind of setting the initial conditions, and there's having a purpose, and those are two separate things. I tend to think there is value in them going together because it enables you to craft one to meet the other.
Yeah.
But I'm also totally cool with people coming into my carefully kept crafted scene, fucking it up with their different purpose to what I had in mind.
Yes. No, I'm totally cool with that as well. And I think that's, I mean, there's again, I think we'll go back to that spectrum of personal preference, that when I go into a scene, I don't go into a scene thinking, I've got a really cool, brilliant idea for how this is all going to play out, and then you come in and derail it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, when I go into a scene, I want someone to have a clear idea of where this is going to go. Yeah. And if two of us have got a clear idea and that kind of derails or causes conflict or challenge, that's actually really cool. What the bad thing is when you go into a scene where no one's got an idea of a purpose, and if you're lucky, one emerges, but I'm not here to be lucky. I'm here to make it work.
Well, I think so. Yeah, and I think my experience of when there isn't a clear purpose setting mechanic or system of some kind, it comes down to the person who's most of a pushy person.
That's a bit judgy.
Well, I don't necessarily mean it in a judgy way. It can be very helpful to be pushy, but it means you've got to have someone who's going to come in and go, oh, fucking hell, everyone's just not doing everything again. I'll take control. I will put, and you can do that in quite a giving way. Yeah. You can come in and kind of take two other characters you suspect to be in love and push them together. But it does require somebody to essentially just grab the reins and do that thing that we've just talked about in the middle of the scene. Which means there's usually a bit of drifting first before they realise that they're going to have to do that.
And I think the reason I wanted to talk about this, and the reason it's really important to me, is because, as we've talked about before, with GMless games, there isn't somebody necessarily who has that purpose and that direction and their role to provide and create it. like as in the same way that there is in GM'd games. And if you are sitting there with a copy of a game that doesn't give you a clear way of determining and setting a purpose for a scene, then it's really helpful to have thought about that beforehand as a player, as part of your play culture. This is also an aside to people who write GM games. Don't say, and now frame a scene, and then just let the dice fall as they will. As I explained to somebody in the other day, that in GMless games, which depend very heavily on scenes, now do a scene to do for X, not giving explicit instructions, not only on how to frame a scene, but how to give a scene purpose, is a little bit like Dungeons and Dragons, taking out all of the THACO, taking out all of the stats and all of the dice on weapons and everything, and now just saying, now roll some dice.
You did explain that to somebody the other day. It was me.
I explained it to two people the other day. You were not. You were the second one.
Goodness me.
But that's how I feel about it. It's like it's such a central part of the game.
So I am gonna suggest that that's not the only way to do it. Actually, which I going into this conversation, I hadn't really realised it, but it seems to me that as the designer, you can be the third person at the table that does that thing. So, like, for example, let's take a really boring example, random encounters, okay? You could have a rule that says if two characters are walking down a corridor and there isn't anything happening, roll a random encounter, and here's a table of things, and then there you go, I've just given you a purpose. Your purpose is to deal with whatever the heck it is that the random encounter table threw up. But you can do that in other ways as well.
I think in some ways it's actually a bit of a shame, though, in the sense that one of the things about GMless story games is that they tend to be very tightly. They cleave very tightly to particular genres a lot of the time. That's part of the beauty of them, is that they tend to have very nice tight scenarios that you're playing often a one shot of something which is very tightly driven. So why would you want to dilute your tight scenario by chucking a random encounter in? Surely you want every scene should count towards moving the story on in an interesting way. I think that's what I'm saying, is if you don't have a way of determining purpose or giving purpose to a scene throughout many of the methods that we've talked about, then you're wasting scenes, aren't you? It seems that you could be moving on the story in an interesting way.
Well, it depends on whether the scene turns out to be good, I guess, and I would suggest that if you have a very tightly designed game, you could maybe have a random table that would relatively reliably introduce stuff that you're going to find interesting. I mean, look at, say, The Quiet Year. I mean, it's not a random table, right? It's a deck of cards, and it doesn't have a scene structure as far as I can recall. So it's maybe a little bit of a strange example, but each card is carefully crafted to address the themes of the game, so I guess I'm saying, like, that you can put stuff into the mechanics that makes you come up with purpose, not necessarily at the beginning of a scene, but potentially during, or at any point in the game.
One thing I would like to just say is that if people have picked up games that don't have a clear purpose in them, thinking about how the game is set, what the genre is of the game, and then working out for your game group different ways to add purpose to the scene, whether that is by saying, by the end of this scene we'll have robbed the bank, or whether it's by saying, okay, there is going to be this is a game which is mostly about conversations between characters, so the dramatic pivot for this scene, the thing that will change our relationships, one of us decides what that is, and that's what we're going to aim for. That's the purpose of the scene. We're going to have a scene which just answers the question of what happened when your wallet got stolen, or what are kind of I suppose I want our listeners to kind of have like an armory of purposes that they can go to a gaming table with. And if they're in a game where there isn't help in framing a purpose, I'm used to framing it, there isn't no mechanical help in getting to what your purpose for a scene is. what could you turn up to a game with in your back pocket to discuss at the table before you start role playing, to get everyone on board with, to help that along.
So I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier about each game being different and each game having its own, and I'll try not to say purpose now, but its own thing that it's trying to do, right? So in Lovecraft-esque, or any investigative game, in fact, the game kind of revolves around information reveal, right?
Yeah.
And you can try and introduce other purposes if you want to a scene, but that's kind of what drives the game forward. But in, say, Flotsam, that is not the case. Revealing information is not a central part of the game. Certainly introducing clues is not a central part of the game. The scenes are therefore framed with very different purposes in mind. So you need to understand what your game's about and think about what's going to add to this game, as opposed to what's the thing that I generally like to do in scenes, right?